Hello and what is up, YouTube? My name is G3Iron, and we asked the question to the community to discuss, summarize your thoughts on Delirium thus far over the opening weekend in 3 words. You can then expand on your thoughts after you give your first 3 words. So I started us off and I said, for me, opening weekend was frustrating, rewarding, and risky. My entire opening weekend, or nearly all of my opening weekend, is recorded on video on demand right here on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch all of the frustration, all of the rewards, and all of the riskiness that came along with Delirium right here. And we wanted to chat for a bit and hear from all of you. So, of course, if you've got a comment with your 3 words of how you would like to describe Delirium thus far, feel free to drop a comment down below. And I'd love to hear from all of you about how your opening weekend was. For me, the reason why Delirium was frustrating was probably similar to many of you. I really wish that all of the loot would pop out at a single moment at the end of an instance, because it's pretty tough. Let's say a 6-socket drops, and we all want jewelers right now at this point in the league because we're rolling for 6-socket and 6-link items. So let's say you want to stop to pick that up. It's worth your time. Well, a whole bunch of monsters inside the Delirium Fog are going to home in on you while you're doing that. Several times on the VOD, I'm using Cyclone, Vol Cyclone, as a Duelist Impale champion build. Several times I would use Vol Cyclone and just pull everything to me. Really bad idea if you are in Delirium. There's a whole bunch of monsters that either will get pulled in with you but still finish their animation, or will simply die on top of you and then explode on top of you while you're still stuck in your animation. So it was a pretty frustrating league to begin with, because of the way how loot works, because of the way how the gray on gray on gray works, which we made a satire video before Path of Exile Delirium released. That, of course, we're going to have a gray on gray on gray league. And I did that originally as a joke, partially because, yeah, it was going to be a gray themed league, but I didn't think it would be this gray. Like, everything is gray or black and you can't see anything that's going on. Like, you can't see ground degens that are underneath the fog. Like, the fog in and of itself is a pretty cool mechanic, but it's pretty frustrating if you have no idea if there's burning ground or caustic ground or some other kind of ground effect that you need to be aware of, because the fog is covering it. It's also a very rewarding league mechanic, whether or not you're running it as for Delirium maps, and you're using Delirium orbs on your maps, or potentially if you're getting a reward type as you interact with a mirror in an encounter, and it's quite beneficial, whether that's currency, whether that's map-related items, whether that's maybe labyrinth-related items, whether that's maybe essence-related items. There are, of course, those reward types that just feel bad as well, like when you're just getting rare items to drop and they're not rare items that you're looking for, or it's too low level of a zone for you even to care about the rare items that are there. And then, of course, on top of all of that, it's very risky, whether that's the boss fight when you combine a bunch of splinters, whether that's the maps that you actually run and you apply Delirium to, whether that's the mirrors themselves. Like, I was running upwards of tier 4 maps, no problem, no rips, no deaths, just fine. Not necessarily running the mirror mechanic though. Then I went back and tried the mirror mechanic on tier 1 maps, and it was much more difficult than tier 4 maps. Now, granted, that's a relatively tight window, tier 4 to tier 1, not necessarily a big spike in difficulty, but it was a massive spike in difficulty with the mirror on tier 1 maps. So it's quite interesting to see how risky and how rewarding this particular league can be. At one point, I had over a dozen different essences drop, had over a dozen incubators drop, had, I think it was 14 or 15 scarabs drop all at once. So it can be a very, very rewarding mechanic, and it can be a very, very rewarding league, and I'm sure we'll all figure out more about those rewards and how to optimize our gameplay as the league goes on. So those were my 3 words to describe Delirium and my opening weekend, but what about you all? Critical Mass says you have died. You could replace that with resurrect at checkpoint, right? Or resurrect in town. Like, this has got to be the least friendly hardcore mechanic that I can even think of. Like, Metamorph was pretty hardcore unfriendly. Thinking back even further, Legion was pretty hardcore unfriendly. Thinking back even further, I can think of things like Abyss or Bestiary. Like, those were all pretty hardcore unfriendly, and yet Delirium has to take the cake. On release, you will simply die. And we've seen the hardcore ladder, whether it's in hardcore trade, hardcore solo self-found, we've seen multiple different leaders take the pole position because people are just dying left and right. to the new mechanics. And we're not just talking about players who are, boomers who have terrible reflexes like G3 Iron over here. We're talking about the peak of the player base that pushes and races to level 100 every single league and that's used to playing on hardcore. A lot of those players are having a really, really tough time with the league mechanics. So You Have Died is a great summary, Critical Mass. Mr. C says, unreadable, thematic, and frustrating. A lot of debuffs are hard to notice until it's too late. So many suicidal enemies and porcupines. Some charge up enemy skills. Looks like they'll be melee, but then they hit you from a range. This is very, very true. I've actually noticed this in multiple different encounters with Delirium mobs. As is always true in Path of Exile, a monster that looks bigger, that's got a bigger wind-up animation, that's got a bigger swing, oftentimes those aren't the scariest guys. The scariest guys are the little teeny tiny guys. If you can think back to Delve, right? When Delve first came out, those little teeny tiny spiders, it wasn't the guys with the big tailwind wind up and then the big massive slow ball of death that you could easily move out of the way for, or you could just tank it because it did no damage. Those weren't the guys you needed to worry for. It was those little tiny spider guys. Those were the guys who could explode and shatter even after you killed them and deal a bunch of damage. And that is true yet again with the fog and the fog monsters who are suicidal in Delirium. It is very frustrating to have that level of gameplay where monsters are more deadly after they die than when they're presently alive. The reality is the theme, I totally agree with you, Mr. C. The theme is pretty cool, and the aspects of the visuals inside the fog are pretty awesome, those that you can see. The rest of them, I feel like there's more there that I should be able to appreciate, but I can't see it because it's gray on gray on gray with a background of black, so it's pretty tough. McLean Harris says, deaths, rewards, and fun. I'm really enjoying this league so far. Ball Lightning Mines is pretty decent for where I'm at right now, white maps, and should scale into endgame. I got to get a combs and level my gems. All right, so one real quick piece of advice that is just off of, the top of an old insane gamer's head. I really think because of a lot of the debuffs inside Delirium, there are so many things that can slow down the player that Combs roots are actually going to be like the AFK don't care about the league mechanic sort of build are going to want to run. If you can fit in a Combs roots into your build and then not be slowed down, not lose your action speed, that is going to be a big, highly desirable pair of boots for the duration of the league, because you won't have to worry about your action speed getting reduced down to near zero, or as some players have shown throughout opening weekend, literally going down to zero. Lootmaster says, never stop moving. Yeah, there is a very real risk and reward if you drop something that's good to like stopping and clicking on it, or just saying, you know what, that's good, but it's not worth me losing my percentage of XP, and it's not worth me losing the fog. Like, I really want to push the fog and get all the way to the boss in this particular part of the zone. Like, builds that are going to be able to off-screen fog monsters and take them down quickly and still continually push through a linear zone are going to be very, very popular this league. Essence Strain Contagion are 3 words. Yep, a lot of players are playing Essence Strain Contagion and finding that it's quite good inside the fog. I haven't heard yet from anybody who's like at tier 16 and taking down bosses yet, but that's because Essence Strain Contagion takes a little bit of gear to generally gear up towards the end game bosses in Path of Exile. So I'd highly expect a lot of players who started as Essence Strain Contagion to start to see their builds fill out and start to see more and more end game bosses go down to Essence Strain Contagion over the next few days. Nysterior says, well, that happened? Yeah, a lot of the time we're just left going, I have no idea what just happened, but I guess I'll open up another portal and finish the rest of this map. Raiden says, very delayed start. Didn't get the game downloaded until 5 or 6 hours after the league launched. Then I had to help work on the car. Same thing on Saturday. I'm just now starting Act 4. Raiden, here's the good news. The good news is if you have a delayed start, so this is a message for everybody who maybe you've had PC problems, maybe you've had performance problems, maybe you've had work or other family commitments, or maybe you're playing on PlayStation or Xbox and you just don't have the game yet. The good news is if you didn't league start this weekend, then hopefully the new patches that are going to be coming out and the new adjustments that are going to be made based off of all of the player feedback from opening weekend are going to make your gameplay experience a little bit smoother. So I know that's like only a very small silver lining in not getting to play and not getting the league start when everybody else does, but it at least means that you don't have to deal with all of the frustrations of the league launch itself, and hopefully you'll have a slightly more optimized performance when you guys get in and start playing Delirium. Blake Barker says, loved, lost, lagged. Overall, I really do like the concept for this league, but the buffs and debuffs during Delirium influence are crazy. This is where, again, I would just say, like, getting curse immunity isn't going to matter because the various debuffs aren't technically called curses. They're not categorized as a curse. So if you're curse immune, it's not going to matter, or reduced curse effectiveness, that's not going to matter. Just having a warding flask isn't going to help you against this stuff. I really think Comb's roots and other ways to maintain your action speed are going to be ways that players are going to try to counteract the different debuffs. And of course, as always, once players get enough currency, players are just going to be one-shotting stuff from across the screen anyway. So early on in the league is when we're experiencing this stuff, but we might not even experience it later on in the league once we all have a little bit more currency and can just fight these mobs at the edge of our screens rather than having to walk up and get relatively close to them as we do now. Aconite001 says, skip the mirror. Mrs. Toot says, I miss Winter Orb. Yeah, Winter Orb and Blade Vortex Poison. I've heard a lot of players are playing the Assassin version of Blade Vortex, which we recommended here on the channel with our 6 league starter builds. Winter Orb would be perfect for this kind of league if it was any good anymore and if it scaled up, because you just charge it up and then away you would go. Mirage Archer builds would also be fantastic for this league. Again, it's too bad that they like nerfed a whole bunch of stuff that bows used during the bow league of 3.9, but what can you do? Anderson Gomez says, laggy, fun, and rewarding. I had a whole breach drop just from Delirium. The new jewels are fun to incorporate into builds. So this is very, very true, and I can echo this. I've already got a large, medium, and small cluster jewel into my build. I think it's fun. I think it's rewarding. Do I know if all of the numbers necessarily add up versus, let's say, just going with a fully min-maxed passive tree on its own? No, I don't think at this point in time we've got all of the numbers that we need to see in order to make judgments on that. But I think as you're filling out your character, if you can find especially a jewel that will give you some very related passives to your specific build. For instance, for me, playing a Cyclone champion that's scaling up with Impales, I got deep cuts that makes my Impales last for an additional hit. That's like half of what the Ascendancy of Champion is there for with Master of Metals, which gives Impale 2 additional hits. So the fact that I've got 1 additional hit off of a passive is really, really helpful and scales up my damage by a noticeable amount. The Ticky says, F Fog Boy. Yeah, Fog, a lot of players are just unhappy with the Fog. And mostly I think it's because the Fog is covering up ground degens. A lot of us wouldn't be so upset if there's a whole bunch of abilities that can kill us, but if we could track them or at least try to track them. The fact that we can't see gray on top of gray on top of gray on top of black is really part of the problem. That, let alone for players who are colorblind or in any way have any kind of color sensitivity. Like if there's any kind of messing with graphical settings or messing with color tones that would make it so that way more abilities were actually visually detectable, that would be great. Touch Me says, added in smartly. The fog mechanic was supposed to be added in smartly and wouldn't affect gameplay performance. Welp, whoops. Yeah, so here's the deal on that. From what I've heard so far from GGG just over the weekend, it's actually not the fog. It's actually the monsters that are being generated. And for those of you who remember Betrayal League, monsters that get generated inside maps generally cause frame rate problems, lag problems, and just crashing problems. And that was a persistent problem throughout the duration of Betrayal League all the way into Synthesis League. So hopefully we get a quicker solution here with Delirium, but I actually am pretty certain it's the monsters that are coming in. It's not the fog. You can actually test this out. After you kill some monsters in an area and there's still fog, just run around in the fog and see if your performance improves. For me, my performance does improve. It's not the fog, it's all the monsters. That's at least for me. I don't know if that's true for you. Brian Z says lag, slow, and difficult. Clean says mana, extra damage. Arcane Cloak is an amazing skill on a mana build. That's actually one of my next 4 builds that I want to try is a Hierophant stacking mana and then just trying to one-shot stuff with whatever spell I can get that'll scale up the most amount of damage off of the Archmage support and then use Arcane Cloak for defensive purposes. I think it's going to be really, really fun. And there's a couple of people who have already featured a couple of different builds on it, and it looks like it's going to be absolutely fantastic. Elio says fast, unstable, and spell slinger. Alex says reminds me of Breach. Not very exciting so far. Fun because it's Path of Exile and trying a new build. I've got to say this, and this is what I'll close on. If you are not having a good time playing Delirium, then don't play, right? This is your hobby time. This is not a time where your boss gets to look over your shoulder and say, should you really be doing that? This isn't a time that your family has got responsibilities and expectations of you. When you've got hobby time that's carved out to play Path of Exile, play what it is that you enjoy. So if that means you enjoy Delirium and enjoy the new league, great. 2 thumbs up. If that means you enjoy playing Standard League because you don't want to deal with all the new bugs that get introduced every couple of months with new league mechanics, then that's great. If you want to go play another game entirely other than Path of Exile because this league's not for you. I know several different major community members inside Path of Exile, whether they're on YouTube, whether they're on Twitch, they're just saying, look, I'm not participating in this league. I can't do it. It's too frustrating. For me, during Sunday's during Sunday's streaming session, for basically the first 2 hours out of 4.5 hours of streaming, it was just me beating my head into a wall due to lag, due to different bugs that were related to my build that had been introduced during Delirium. And so for me, it was like 2 hours of trying to get things to work and figure out. And then once I got everything figured out, sure enough, I had a great time playing. But for a lot of players, we don't have a 4-hour session with 2 hours that we can bug fix and just work around stuff, right? For a lot of us, we might only get to play for 2 hours a day. So don't spend 2 hours of your hobby time, that's your time to enjoy your gaming and your hobby. Don't spend it just frustrated beating your head into a wall. If something isn't fun for you, don't do it and move to something that is fun. So hopefully with patch notes and with more fixes that will come down the line, Delirium will be improved for performance and for enjoyability, and we'll all be able to look back on Delirium and say, hey, wasn't that a great league, as opposed to looking back on Delirium and saying, wow, that was an absolute flop. Well, thanks so much for all of your comments and participating on this particular discussion. I look forward to reading all your comments below and interacting with every single one of you. And of course, as always, I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you in Delirium, in Standard League, or wherever it is that you're playing Path of Exile. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.